I think we can kick off. Welcome to LSE Cities of Tomorrow series, which is a collaboration between LSE Global Real Estate Group and LSE Alumni Association London. My name is Didem Erendil and I'm the president for LSE Global Real Estate Group. Today's webinar will be focusing on building for the future, ESG in global real estate, with our distinguished speakers, Louise Ellison, Robert Adamczyk, and Arthur Krebbers. I will be co-hosting this event with Adi from LSE Greg Executive Committee. A quick reminder that we have a Q&A tool where you can submit your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll have a 15-minute Q&A session at the end of our discussions, which will be managed by Martin from LSE. Before we start, I would be glad if everyone could introduce themselves very briefly. Adi, would you like to go first, and then we can continue with our speakers?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Didem. So I'm Adi Gokal. I am part of the LSE Greg Executive Committee. I also work at Great Portland Estates, and I manage the corporate finance team there.
Louise? Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Louise Ellison. I'm the Group Head of Sustainability at Hammerson. I'm also the Chair of the Sustainability Committee at EPRA and the Chair of an organisation called the Better Buildings Partnership.
Robert?
Hello, I'm Robert Adamczyk from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I'm a Senior Environmental Advisor in the bank and dealing with ESG issues in the bank and the regions where we invest.
And finally, Arthur.
Afternoon, Arthur Krebbers. I run sustainable finance for the corporate client base at NatWest Markets.
Thank you very much. I would like to start with Robert. Sustainable investing is no longer a niche area, and environmental, social, and governance criteria is moving into the mainstream. So I would be glad if you could give us a background as a basis for our discussions. What is ESG, how it has evolved, why it is important?
Okay. Thank you very much. I think the general introduction is that environmental and social issues have moved fundamentally in the past 20, 30 years. We went in from sustainability, then of course CSR, to now ESG, and environmental issues and social and governance issues are at the forefront of a lot of discussions, be it on climate, be it in terms of the buildings, the structures that we live in, and also the approach to circular economy and the way actually we live our lives and will do following the pandemic. So I've been tasked or asked to sort of say about the evolution, how it's evolved, why is it as important, to maybe kick off. In many ways, it went from philanthropy, you could say, in the original stages of a few people dealing with environmental issues or niche markets, certain areas, but specifically looking at certain products. So evolving into, I think, what's now becoming the core and will become a core of investments, particularly if we look at some of the post-COVID-19 funding, where much of it will be linked, in my view, to green finance. The EU policies on sustainable finance would actually be a very important driver of what is available from the funding side. Now, ESG is, of course, environmental social governance, and it includes environment, the climate change, but also just general sustainability, pollution, biodiversity, and waste. The social, of course, includes human rights, labor, health and safety, diversity and inclusion, which are all topics extremely important in this day and age, and the social side in terms of social distancing as well will become even more important. And the governance, particularly if we look at real estate, is everything from anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, and conflicts of interest and general corporate governance, which in the real estate, particularly in some regions where we invest as the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is mainly in emerging markets, is extremely important. So altogether, that has formed now the new criteria, the new approach of assessing investments. Many pension funds will invest, particularly in ESG. We're trying to get our pension funds to invest mainly into ESG related funds. So I think in terms of engaging how we move forward, we have to take into account where financing will be, from what sorts of places financing will be available. And in the post-COVID-19 world, the European Union will be a major source of financing. Many of the bonds will be issued in terms of green bonds, and will it affect real estate? Yes, it will, because we all actually have to compete for the funds. We'd also have to look at some of the key issues. For instance, it's not about ESG, it's smart buildings, health and safety, resilience, wellness will also become important in terms of how we manage our portfolios. And these areas we need to remember. And I think that's wanted just to sort of kick off, but particularly important from my side is the EU dimension, but also the UK is following the same approach and will do, and how funding will affect in this part of the world what we do.
How do you think the regulatory framework of the EU will impact investment decisions? Which are the main regulatory issues coming up now?
Well, we have currently, because we had the Green Deal, we have the European Sustainable Finance Package being approved, and the entire EU taxonomy outlining what will be invested and how invested. So there will be new standards in terms of reporting, requirements in terms of how we undertake sustainable finance, and this will set the criterion which will need to be transposed into national legislation, but will allow us to look at the funding. So most international institutions like ourselves, or the European Investment Bank, which is of course investing a lot in the European Union, but also treasuries will work towards those guidelines in the future. And I think there is pressure, and there's pressure throughout also in the UK, of tying investment to climate change or reducing the impacts. And I think the social aspects will become extremely important. So yes, the legislation's coming, it's being introduced, and it's the new approach that is moving very fast, because if we look at the EU side, it's been developed in the past 2-3 years. We have the Paris Agreement and therefore Paris alignment. All of this will need to be reflected in terms of the reporting, disclosure, and how we actually undertake finance in the future.
Thank you very much. Taking from the social aspect, we know one of the key drivers has been social change as well. So Arthur, in your view, how generational differences play a role on ESG, the demand actually for integrating ESG criteria into investment decisions?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Didem. And if you look at the survey evidence that is out there, it's very consistent that the millennial generation and Gen Z after that, you know, it's numbers around the 90% plus that say that they care or strongly care about sustainability considerations when making investment decisions. And in fact, I think it goes broader than that. You know, there's also research suggesting this is an important factor when they're making employment decisions, when they're making consumption decisions. You know, and those variables are often double that for sort of baby boomer and older generations. So within NatWest, you know, we're seeing this every time we do a recruitment fair. You know, perhaps 15, 20 years ago, we would get approached about our M&A or, you know, equity research, et cetera, capabilities. And now the common denominator question is, what are you doing about sustainable finance? So I think that generational element is absolutely critical and is being realized by the senior management of a lot of key sort of financial market and indeed real estate market participants.
Thanks, Arthur. I'd like to touch on measurement and scoring of ESG, and I'd like to start with Louise, and 3 questions in one really. What are the main issues with measuring and scoring ESG? Does measurement need some form of international standardization? And lastly, if you could touch on greenwashing, and is there any problems with greenwashing in the industry?
Oh yes, happy to. There's a number of those kind of issues that we could talk about. I mean, measuring challenges with measurement of ESG have been with us for a long time. We are getting much better at it, but as Robert has set out so clearly for us, this is a very wide-ranging topic with very many different facets to it, and that consequently very many different ways of measuring it, which will vary globally from country to country, depending on what are the most important issues for different countries, what are their key impacts, all sorts of things. And businesses operating in different jurisdictions have lots of challenges around being able to get that right. Some of the elements that we try to tackle in terms of ESG are not necessarily easily quantifiable. I can tell you how much power our portfolio is using. I can tell you how many people are employed roughly across the portfolio, but we begin to get a little bit more flaky once we get to that. I can't tell you how much necessarily, very accurately, how much power our tenants are using across our portfolio. I can tell you, that you immediately start getting into slightly more or slightly less robust numbers, and you're having to do quite a lot of modelling. So trying to then make comparisons potentially across countries to make some kind of assessment of a business, one business against another in terms of its ESG performance through a single figure benchmark becomes almost impossible and quite meaningless. So there are a number of problems associated with it and challenges. That doesn't mean it's not possible to do, and it doesn't mean it's not important, and potentially makes it even more important. It does rely a lot on data, and a lot of work has been done over the last few years to get better at data and get improved data, particularly around carbon emissions and environmental reporting. I think that's come quite a long way. And international standards around the Kyoto protocols, the GHG standards and things have really set the standard, and things like the EPRA sustainability best practice reporting standards, which are mirrored in the INREV standards. These types of things that are specific to the real estate sector, but these types of things have been very helpful in getting some standardization. Likewise, around social, we're starting to see more greater standardization around the social indicators that are used, but we're already starting to see and have seen things of people sort of creating social value studies and coming up with wildly big, huge figures in terms of the social value they're sort of claiming for something, because they're claiming things right the way through a supply chain which aren't additional. They would have been happening anyway. There's all sorts of slightly kind of well, not necessarily particularly robust numbers going on in some of the social impact reporting that's being done. So you have to be very careful about, and we're always very careful about coming back to what are the real numbers, what are the real impacts you want to measure. So there are complications around it. Whether or not it needs, but it doesn't mean that it's not incredibly important to do, and we need to keep moving in that direction. Do we need some sort of international standardization? I'm always a little bit wary of standardization, because you can end up getting, in order to get something that's sufficiently simplified, that's sufficiently simple to standardize, you can end up not getting anything particularly meaningful out of it. Having said that, there are ways in which you can look at the sort of things that everybody needs to report, so you can get some standardization around. And I think that comes back to what Robert was talking about in terms of where we start doing green bonds and financing and all of those kinds of things. There's going to be some standard things that you have to declare, and you have to explain how you're doing it. Those kinds of things, you could set some international standards at that level, and things like the GRI reporting framework has started to, that set a good benchmark in starting to do that. So I think international standardization is a direction of travel we're going in. What you can't do is expect to end up with one number and compare one company against another company, or a project against another project, or one piece of infrastructure against another with a single number. It's just too complex, and it's lazy effectively to try and think you can do that. You need to be properly invested in actually delivering good data on this and understanding it thoroughly, and understanding who you're investing in and what they're doing. So yes, some level of standardization, but it's not going to be the kind of silver bullet that's going to solve everything for us. And then the flip side of that, I think, is probably where greenwashing steps in, because there is, particularly because there's so much discussion at the moment about net zero carbon targets and setting net zero carbon targets, which we've set net positive targets. ADU, the GPs have also set net zero carbon targets. There's a lot of businesses across the sector doing that at the moment, which is very good. We're all setting those targets, but how we go about that, particularly in terms of offsetting, and at the moment offsetting is the big one in terms of greenwashing. Businesses need to be very clear about where they stand on offsetting and what they're doing. Offsetting is an important part of the solution to some of this, but it can also be used hugely to obfuscate and to sort of make businesses end up thinking that they have delivered something when actually they're not really delivering the first things they need to deliver around efficiencies. So there is quite a lot of greenwashing, and I think fundamentally it's a business management issue, and it's quite dull really. You do need to come down to the numbers and really being as efficient as you can. So being able to put up a flashy building is great, but actually being able to know what your numbers are, set targets, and get your processes in place to deliver on them, that's much, much more efficient. And you can't really greenwash that. It's not terribly exciting in terms of PR.
Right.
Does that help?
And that helps a lot, thank you. And Arthur and Robert, I saw you nodding along as Louise was talking, so any comments from you would be great as well.
Yeah, it was two things that came to mind that perhaps to add to Louise's answer. One of my favorite stats in the world of sustainable finance is that when you compare credit rating agencies, right, so the language of credit risk, the correlation between your Moody's and S&P and Fitch is about 90%, right? It's rare to get an organization or an asset that's AAA by one and triple B by another. If you take that into the world of ESG analysis, so how ESG impactful or robust is a company, the correlations are rarely more than 50% between some of the leading ESG data and rating agencies. So I agree with Louise, we'll never get to the point where we get to the same answer, but for a lot of investors, it's far too fragmented still, the methodologies and the approaches. When it comes to greenwashing, within the context of green bonds and sustainable instruments, I don't think that's a big concern. And you're starting to see a move in the market now where we're trying to make this a broader church. So green bonds are only 2% of global debt, but clearly there's a multiple of that in terms of projects that could be financed and that are environmentally impactful. And that's where you're seeing this array of new labels like transition bonds, sustainability linked bonds arise to try and attract new companies into this market who may be afraid of labeling themselves as a green bond for greenwashing concerns, but are doing very positive things.
And if I may add, I think, yes, it's a big issue. Greenwashing is a big concern also for us. We work in, of course, different markets, sometimes less developed. Things are packaged in different ways, but it is a major challenge for our stakeholders and shareholders to ensure that when it is green, and we are setting targets in that way. So setting certain disclosure and reporting requirements is fundamental. And I think one of the first stages of actually getting things right is ensuring transparency and disclosing the same, comparing apples with apples. So this is maybe why there's so much work in terms of some of the climate data and climate reporting, particularly setting out what information should be provided in disclosed materials, because that is quite varied. And there's the entire task force in terms of climate financial disclosure, again, aimed to set out what should be put in and what the requirements are. And these are real issues because you will look at, let's say, if you are a diesel producer producing diesel engines, your future is a bit dimmer. If you're a coal miner, your future in certain parts of the world is even less bright than some other industries. But at least you need to provide how you will transit and how that entire transition will take place from your current operations to future operations, which is, I think, where the regulations come in and try to address that. And people will be greenwashing. And I agree here, it is at the end of the day, the analysts will need to review and a judgment made case by case. But if you have the right benchmark in terms of the information, then those judgments can be made. And I think this is, for us, a fundamental issue, or for me particularly, is trying to get the ESG, the right level of information to be disclosed to enable people to make the right decision in terms of benchmarking, because there will be the different rating agencies, they might classify things differently, but at the end of the day, it is within our institutions. But for instance, at the EBRD, we make the judgment whether it is or not, and look at criteria, not using external that much resource for that.
I think that there's also quite an important point to think about in terms of thinking laterally about where climate change will hit and what sort of industries it will hit. Because the obvious ones are the extractive industries and potentially those, the construction industry, who might be affected by this. But actually, all industries are going to be affected somehow, and some of them more than others, and potentially in ways that they wouldn't necessarily expect to be affected by it. So whether it's a lack of availability of a particular crop, or labour moving somewhere else, there's all sorts of things that will happen over the next 20 or 30 years, which businesses need to be thinking about now. So, and I think that's kind of part of the requirement that TCFD have laid down about doing climate scenario work, not just to look at, and for a company like Hammerson or GPE, it's not for us to just look at what's the physical impact on our assets, whilst we need to understand that. It's also to look at our business and think, well, actually, are the other businesses who are our clients now and our customers, are they going to be in the same position in 10 years' time? Do we need to completely change? If we've got big assets in city centres, what's going to happen to those city centres? Are we looking at massive population shift, for example, and is that going to change the social makeup of the cities where we're operating? All sorts of much more nuanced things that need to be thought about in terms of ESG.
And I think if I can add here, it's in the real estate, it's going to, we'll look at risks, flooding risks, other issues which are climate related, which will affect your portfolios. But right now, in terms of the social aspect and governance I spoke about, particularly in some jurisdictions, is, are your buildings fit for purpose? What's going to be the future approach? Have you actually brought in the right resilience? And that will be a major issue which people will want to look in terms of moving in the future. Is that portfolio fitting in a certain path, or has taken into consideration the right criterion, which will be now important in terms of social distancing, how we operate? Can we actually have the flexibility of redesigning the office space in the right way, or is it fixed? The location. So that will affect as well as fundamentally, because there will be, I think, a new way of working, a new way of approach. And as Arthur said, the consumers will, the young consumers and the future consumers will be more savvy. They would look at and research more in terms of whether this is something they want to invest in, whether they want to work there, whether they want to use those products, more than my generation has, definitely. I would have probably not thought about these things as much and would go in the shop and buy something or not, but that is ingrained. And that's, I think, a fundamental issue. People will use, therefore, the ESG, or like you use before going on holiday, whether you go somewhere or not, and use someone, you'll check the how many stars they have, and these stars become important. That's going to be as well in terms of ESG. How many stars you get and the ratings will be just as important as we do sometimes our shopping.
Yeah, I would echo that. The sort of the motto that we've been using with a lot of client discussions is, ESG will be the next investment grade. If an asset or a company does not meet minimum environmental, social, governance standards, disclosure, and policies, it will become dramatically harder to finance. And that, I think, to the first question about what has evolved, this used to be, as Robert said, philanthropy, perhaps a bit of PR, a bit of goodwill building. And in the last few years, it's become a defensive play for a lot of companies. They cannot afford to rest on their laurels and let someone else define their sustainability narrative, because if they do so, they will lose out on, in terms of their competitors, in terms of access to talent, in terms of access to financing, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. In terms of the period of my career and over the last kind of 15 to 20 years, there's been a massive shift to what you could do to now what you have to do. And it was always a sort of that was always sort of optional. And if you were a business that was particularly interested in it, it would be something that you'd be interested in doing. But really, it was an optional thing, and it was often sat within the corporate comms teams, and which was all fantastic. But it has shifted completely into something that you have to do. And I think the social element, Robert, you're absolutely right. And I think it also will hit. It starts looking at the residential side as well. And there's been so much investment in real estate over the last few years, particularly in build to rent. That sector has been very lively. But over the last 6 months, if you start looking at the sort of buildings that are being built to rent and the design of those apartments and things, how are people actually going to be able to fund them and live in them when they're actually also working from home as well? So actually, what does that do to the space, the economics of what we're designing and the land values if you actually suddenly a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom flat becomes impossible to actually let because nobody can work in it and everybody's having to do much more work from home. So those kinds of immediate social impacts are happening. And then if as an industry you're not really, or as a sector you're looking at large city centre schemes, how are you bringing your local community with you? Because you absolutely, you don't want to be funding what would become effectively tomorrow's ghettos, if you like. You need to be funding things that are bringing that community with them and providing the social infrastructure that needs to go with that, providing the education, the healthcare, all of those things, the green spaces, the outdoor space, which there are excellent examples of exactly that being done and really, really great schemes. But as a sector, we can be quite short term in terms of our thinking about things. It's kind of, we are set up to look at short term funding as much as we are at long term funding in order to make things viable, which can be a challenge for us.
Within the context of real estate, I find it very striking that 80% of the buildings we will have in 2050 have already been built. I think this is something very significant. So the property sector actually is really relevant for achieving these sustainable goals. I just want to ask you, how would you rate real estate industry's commitment to ESG, following what you just said, Louise?
Well, I mean, for real estate, yeah, I mean, all of as you say, 80% of buildings have been are already here. There's a huge kind of body of work looking at refurbishment and looking at the embodied carbon that we've got in all of those buildings. There will be kind of wholesale change of the way in which we use buildings, but I think there is much more appetite for looking at redesign, looking at flexibility, but we still don't really build a huge amount of flexibility. I mean, a long time ago, doing research on this, we were looking at with a team of people, and we were looking at the important elements of what makes a building sustainable. And flexibility is one of those key elements of it. You have to be flexible across use as well as within use for a building to actually have a kind of be pushed beyond kind of even a kind of 20, 30, 40-year life. And that's still quite hard to deliver and quite hard to achieve. So a number of those buildings, yes, they are existing. Whether or not we can actually transform them into buildings that that are fit for purpose, as Robert and Arthur have said, whether we can actually create buildings that are fit for purpose out of them and that are going to be economically productive by the time we get to 2050 is a slightly different question.
If you look at the green, I mean, if you look at the stats, it's anywhere from 30 to 40% of carbon emissions can be linked to buildings. So I fully echo it. This is critical to get right for the UK and any sort of economy's commitment to the Paris Agreement. And then if you look at the green bond market, there has been a rapid rise in real estate specific green debt. But really, any company who we're advising on in terms of structuring a green or sustainable instrument, we're always asking them about their offices, their factories, their other buildings, and not just identifying the ones that are already best in class, but also identifying refurbishments works that they're doing. And I thought it was interesting. We did a green bond a year and a half ago for a large warehouse real estate firm for Prologis. And when we came out with that bond, you saw that the credit rating agency Moody's, they announced that them issuing a green bond was enhancing for their credit profile. It would improve the asset value, it would improve their access to clients, and it would improve their access to financing as well.
I think we'll have to look and with the current pandemic, and depending on how everything sort of pans out, or once the dust settles, I think we'll have to review where we go, because the future of cities, the green cities, how we want to live will also change. And we'll have, of course, companies and assets, as Dr. Prologis and others will really get the enhanced benefit in terms of what they do. But how we live is going to be changed. We will still go back to offices to a certain extent, but some offices will no longer be needed. And this is going to be, of course, you'll have some issues of stranded assets. The fact that you have an office building that is difficult to retrofit, is difficult to move. It might be even 5-10 years old. It's might be worthless. And that is, so I think the choice, because we will be using less office space than we did before, at the same time potentially needing more space because you need the social distancing in those, and the more assigned desks. And this is, I think, debate whether we have assigned desks or not, and office space or not is, I think, still ongoing and continues to go. But there will be, you could say, particularly stranded assets. And that will, in anything we do, be it due to climate issues, due to the lack of water, your hydro dams might be no longer as profitable as they were. But in terms of buildings, some of these buildings might have to be basically torn down or changed. And that is going to be a big aspect. I think this issue of 80% or in 2050, how much of building stock will remain, is going to be, I don't know, it's a bit of a sort of crystal ball, but will it all be there? I don't think so. I mean, if I look at, I do a lot of heavy industry, what was said 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you're building coal-fired power stations and some of the steel plants, they no longer exist in many of the Western countries. They were seen to be there for the next 100 years, the same with nuclear power. So I think some of our buildings will also have this, you could say, issue with them. They will not be needed. There will be many, and I think we are social beings, therefore we will want to be meeting, and I think this weekend has shown how people have flocked together the opening of bars, so irrespective of the health warnings, but it will, I think, change, and it will therefore change, and always in the change, the best are the ones that survive. Those that are most advanced, the most flexible and pragmatic, are the ones that are going to be coming out of this in the best way. In the same way, it's showing that ESG funds generally perform better than other funds. That's the sort of, although let's see, by next year we can make, I think, the real judgments. But there are some, I think that's going to be a key driver, who survives, who not, and it's always the best that do. And when we did due diligence even 20, 30 years ago, with starting off, telling my age, but it is an area where it was the good companies, where were they going, be it privatization or investment, that had environmental management systems. Those are the ones that actually are better. It didn't mean all of them. We have, of course, the cases of Enron and others collapsing, although they had great environmental policies. But as a general trend, if you had good environmental, social, good governance, you are likely to actually outperform the market on average.
That's a really interesting point about the stranded assets, because if you think about risk management and forecasting and scenario planning around climate change specifically, but indeed ESG more broadly, I mean, there's this sort of the physical risk of climate change, as Louise has mentioned, right? The flooding, extreme weather events. What does that do to asset values? But then there's this sort of more subtle transition risk. So as behaviors, as regulation, as expectations develop, at what point do certain assets become worthless? And that could be buildings, that could be cars, it could be all sorts of other assets, and then that, from a banking perspective, is much harder to anticipate. But sometimes changes in behavior can happen very quickly, and a colleague of mine often refers to sort of the plastic straw case, right? A number of years ago, they were everywhere, And now in sort of London bars and restaurants, you would generally be shocked to be offered a plastic straw. It's sort of your paper straw. So these things can happen quite quickly, but modeling them is less straightforward.
Yeah, and I mean, you could point to some oil fields, couldn't you, that might not be quite as valuable as people once thought they were not very long ago.
Thanks all. I'd now like to just quickly touch on green financing and probably one for you initially, Arthur. And just, it would be great if you could just talk through the evolution of green or sustainably linked financing and where you see that going in the future. You mentioned only 2% of bonds are currently green. Will that be 10 or 20% in the next few years?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, it's the youngest part of the market, this space. It began about 12, 13 years ago with a number of development banks wanting to add more environmental disclosure and impact to their financing, and that then got enshrined in the green bond principles from the International Capital Markets Association. And we saw uptake from particularly utilities and real estate companies that helped spark the growth. Now, where's that going to lead to? We're seeing, particularly when it comes to the green label, more regulation put in place to effectively make a green bond as robust a concept as, say, a covered bond or a mortgage-backed security, etc. Just create very common standards and expectations. And to Robert's point, that's what a key part of a lot of the European regulation. So I think sort of having green bonds in a more structured format will be one element which will develop. But I think what we'll see is significant in innovation as well in terms of other labels that are more suitable for different sectors and different parts of the economy. So I referred to transition bonds earlier, social bonds, circular economy bonds, sustainability bonds, etc. So we'll see different forms of use of proceeds. And for me, the other bit of innovation that's very interesting is adding real legal and economic bite to sustainability. So the sustainability linked bond principles just came out, and that allows you to link the coupon or another facet of a debt instrument to a company meeting its sustainability target. So then it's no longer just a pledge to do good stuff with the money, but it's actually a real carrot and stick approach where the company's cost of funding changes if it doesn't meet sustainability commitments. So I think that will develop. And perhaps the final trend, green bonds were all about spending money on a subset of your assets that do environmental good. I think we'll get to the concept of green issues. So the concept of every issuer needs to have a credit rating to show that it's low credit risk or appropriate credit risk, but also some form of ESG rating or disclosure to show that its ESG standards are also in line with market expectations.
So actually, can we say ESG is not just doing the right thing anymore? It has financial relevance as well, because there's a big discussion around whether it's a trade-off between, I've read it somewhere, I liked it, values, trade-off between value and values. So what do you think about it?
It's a great question. That there's more and more research coming out, and to Robert's point, post-COVID has seemed to confirm this, that funds and investors and indeed companies who have higher ESG scores tend to also make for better credit risk. There's lots of exceptions to that as well, but this is sort of what the statistics seem to be suggesting. I think that's one interesting conclusion. And the other one is that companies who have done a green bond seem to also find there's this halo effect, that there's a share price outperformance, there's an outperformance of their regular debt. And if you look at them 2 years later, their profitability improves. So somehow doing environmental good and being focused on your ESG policies and disclosure makes good business sense.
And I think maybe if adding here, I watched recently, was it Dark Waters, the film, which looks at the liabilities and use of Teflon. It came out in a lot of the history, it is about liabilities. And that's the first issue, be it asbestos liabilities, be it contaminated land liabilities, be it health and safety and potential health impairment claims. And that, of course, was the initial why do environmental due diligence, why have environmental management systems, compliance being one of, is to reduce your risks and therefore increase profitability. And that has been a key focus. And it's just moving on right now in terms of what society demands and what society sets the thresholds in terms of how we behave, how corporations behave. The governance side in terms of corruption, and of course the fines associated with illegal practices are quite high and be very substantially high. Environmental maybe liabilities, depending on your jurisdictions, haven't been always very high, but they can be significant in terms of your reputational and therefore business impacts, how you operate and whether you survive or not as well. So does it make business sense? Yes, it does. How far we go, I think, is also the demand. If there is a demand, there is a market, and the general, as we discussed, younger people look at things differently. The institutional investors as well are starting to take into account, and have for a long time, environmental and therefore social and now governance risk. You do not want to be associated reputationally with bad investments. Investments that cause damage or associated with regimes you don't want to be associated with. And that, I think, so it's a moving curve, and it's going in, and it's always, regulations always tighten up, but it's also the market demand. It's still a small amount, and of course it is not the predominant amount. It's like you still have arms, tobacco and other areas doing very well, and oil business extremely well. But in your long-term pension fund, where would you want to invest it? What sort of decisions you will make, even as a saving for your pension, will start to put pressures in terms of those funds. So the market is being driven throughout. And if I look at, there's a question I think coming in, which is on whether some banks provide, take into consideration ESG ratings, some others, and I might lose business. Yes, you might lose short-term business, but I think the business is quite robust and there is business. So the question is what type of business you want, short-term, long-term, more sustainable, and who are your clients. And that will be a major aspect in the decision-making. And if the regulators and the commission, for instance, pushes a certain amount of financing in one direction, that will make an impact. We'll see what happens in the US after the election if it goes in that direction as well. But that will also be then a focus which way to go.
And I think if you bring it down to asset level, we would already expect to be asked for quite detailed information through due diligence process on any assets that we were trading, and I think, you know, if that reveals that there's been an underinvestment or that there are compliance risks and things with an asset, it will affect the pricing. So it's certainly not a conflict between value and values. I think the other way round. I think if you haven't demonstrated and you haven't been effective in delivering on ESG, you'll start seeing it pretty quickly in the traded value of the assets that you have.
Robert mentioned the question that indeed came in, and it's one that you know does come up in banking circles. You know, is there a niche for a brown polluting focused bank if those start becoming quite high yielding, compelling sort of assets? And I think if you look at the direction of travel for regulation, and a body that we're very interested in is the NGFS, the Network for Greening of the Financial System. You've got 3/4 of the world's central banks in that body, and their whole reason for being is to try and get commercial banks to be at the forefront of the carbon transition. And that's quite simple, because once you've regulated the banks to do that, that forces the rest of the real economy to adjust, because anyone who's reliant on banks for lending and for capital will then be forced to adjust. So trying to operate some sort of polluting bank will just become, from a regulated point of view, as well as from many other points of view, as we've discussed, really not a compelling proposition. So I don't see sort of usage of ESG ratings as sort of a competitive disadvantage from that perspective.
And I think, sorry.
Go on. You go.
And I think just it is a global trend. It's not just Western Europe. If we work in worldwide, it will be also some of the lenders in the Far East will have the same principles. If we have even one of the biggest banks being established in terms of IFIs, the Asian or AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is adhering to the same principles and doing the same things, Asian Development Bank. So this is a worldwide trend, and all big players and big countries are taking that on board, and maybe some more than others. But if I talk to colleagues in Russia, if I talk to colleagues in Beijing, they're also applying the same type of yardsticks, maybe some better, some worse, and worldwide. But overall, I think there's a very similar approach.
Thanks. And I think we focused quite a lot on the E and G element during this conversation. And is the current pandemic a good opportunity to really now focus on the well-being side of things? And how do you see that S part of ESG developing? Louise?
Well, firstly, I think that the social element of ESG goes way beyond well-being, and we have to be. I mean, well-being is very much a kind of a word of the moment, if you like, and it's something that we're thinking about a lot. But the social elements and the social impacts that investing can have are pretty wide-ranging, and they will be different from geography to geography depending on where you are and what your business is. For a real estate perspective, obviously there's a huge amount that you can do, and that the real estate sector does, in terms of bringing investment into a local community and into a local area. And making sure that is actually kind of benefiting the community that you're working with is an important thing to do. But it's not always easy. And you can find yourself in a situation where it's easy to kind of write a check that will go with a planning permission. We can all do that if we have to, but actually delivering things locally with impact takes quite a lot of local community engagement, very good relationship building and stakeholder engagement, and that's when you get, from a real estate perspective, I think that's when you get good land values as a result of your efforts in terms of community engagement and real social impact, real long-term social impact. And obviously there's benefits for a business like us, and a business like GP will be the same. Having those strong local relationships makes it much easier for you when you start looking at further development and additional development, because you develop trust. Even if you're going into a new geography, you can take your examples of what you've done before. This is how we work with the local community. This is what we deliver, and Hammerson has done this for years. I mean, with the work we did with Bullring in the centre of Birmingham, and just completely transforming some of those areas around Birmingham in a very positive way. Same that we've done in Silverburn, in outside Glasgow, all sorts of other areas. And that's incredibly important. As a real estate company, you might not be, even if you're not that big. I mean, we're not a kind of massive company, but there's something like, I think we estimated in 2017 that was over 2 billion of inward investment that was generated because of work that we've done in the local communities where we were operating just across our portfolio. There's something like 40,000 people employed across our assets, of course not by us, but by the people who we're providing space for. Any of the property companies will have, and any of the big fund managers, you'll have real estate portfolios which have got huge numbers of people employed within them. So then trying to kind of work with your stakeholders makes a difference. If you can work then with your, and we do quite a lot of work with our tenants, who are effectively our customers, to get them to think about those end user jobs, skills and training, very direct things that you can do with the community which transforms it. What are you feeding into what are your relationships with local schools, local colleges, to try to make sure that you're really delivering something back and making sure that you are providing effective community space, those kinds of things that really help the local community and help locals, and understanding what those real issues are. I mean, we have very different issues locally at our assets in Scotland, for example, than we do in the south of France. Completely different, obviously. So we have to work with local stakeholders and local groups in order to find out to try to help resolve some of those local issues. So there's an awful lot that the real estate sector can and does do, and I think part of ESG measurement and reporting has enabled the sector to be much more clear about what it's doing and to really give a voice to some of the work that we're doing. And as part of that, then it sort of begins to snowball a little bit, because as you talk more about it, your internal stakeholders, and some of whom may not necessarily be aware of some of the great things that you're doing, they want to do more, and you just get more, it gets more credibility, and it starts to kind of expand. So there's a lot that does happen, not just around compliance, but also around what really works for you in a business, and it has huge kind of knock-on positive impacts for all of us as businesses if we do make sure that we're making the right kind of investment and generating that kind of local impact and positive local economic growth. I mean, it hits cultural as well. I mean, there's a lot of work we do with arts programs and theatres and all of those kinds of things. So actually just bring more enlivenment, more interest, and just supporting those things that really are the kind of fabric, if you like, of a local community. Hugely important for us.
From a capital markets perspective, we'd already seen pre-COVID more of a move towards broader societal goals, so not just the environmental, and things like the yellow vest protests in France sort of reinforce that. You can't look narrowly at environmental pursuits and ignore disadvantaged, disenfranchised communities. And the UN Sustainable Development Goals have formed an important sort of benchmark and denominator for increasing number of market participants in thinking about those kind of strategies. But for sure, COVID has accelerated that, and we're seeing investors now becoming more diligent, not just in the E questioning, but also in the S questioning, be that human capital, be that supply chain, community relations, executive compensation, and all those kind of topics. So I think in the same way as in 2008, you know, the financial crisis challenged a number of credit rating models, right? We saw that assets that seemed to be AAA weren't AAA. You may well find now that with COVID, it challenges some of the certain existing ESG methodologies, and we know some of the larger, you know, rating agencies in this space are rethinking their approach to ESG metrics in response to COVID.
And I think this is a big issue. The E side environment is, you could say, old hat. It's easier to quantify and understand. And actually, we all understand it nowadays to an extent. The social side is in many ways more complex, more fluid. And I think post-COVID-19, it will be the question as how did people behave? How did they behave with their staff, with their customers? How did they actually, any contingency plans? And who do you once again be associated with in terms of as reputationally, as an investor or as a partner, whether that was a good, socially good company or not. And environment is going to be easier. It's easier to quantify. The G side, I think, is going to be even more complex and will start to come up further. The governance side and how companies are governed is going to, I think, be the future trend. But the social side, we will have, following the next few years, we're going to have significant social problems. I think there's no question about it in terms of unemployment, in terms of the disenfranchised communities. That is going to be a major issue because the economies have taken a big hit. And therefore the social side might become even more important to assess. Ascertain how people employment will become more important, and it's maybe not going to be the social value is not just pure profit, but in terms of how you treat and work with your employees, your stakeholders, and the overall community. So I see this as being the future challenge. And when we look at people to recruit properly, sometimes the biggest problem is the environment is easy to recruit, the social is not. And that is, I think, also a very important aspect. And I think the G will be even more difficult.
I think that's true, and I think it adds so much value, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see the businesses who over the next, well, certainly how businesses responded over the last 2 quarters or the last kind of getting on for 6 months, and how businesses respond over the next 12 months and beyond in terms of understanding who their local stakeholders are and actually working with those communities to help support them. Because obviously it's about your own workforce and what's going on within your business, but for businesses who are very public facing and not necessarily as a brand, but in terms of the assets that we have, there's a huge amount of, there's going to be so much work that we need to do with those local stakeholder relationships to make sure that those who are really going to struggle in some of those cities around the world are properly supported and helped, and that you're taking a seat at the table and starting and really trying to press for change in which some of the that kind of hollowing out of certainly some of the social infrastructure that we've seen in the UK over the last 10 to 12 years starts moving back in the other direction, because we can't continue to kind of operate in a system where you're putting in kind of mitigating measures with kind of charities in order to try to stop there being quite so many homeless people sleeping outside your assets. It's just not a viable way to kind of carry on as a society. So actually what the businesses really are doing to continue, even under these very difficult circumstances that a lot of the businesses are now finding themselves in, what are you doing grassroots with your local community to try and really support them and get some change driven? I think that's going to be really an interesting one for some of the ratings agencies and some of those investors to really get to understand really what businesses are like.
I fully agree with that. And I would say, and Robert rightly mentioned, that the quantification issue is less straightforward with social, right? There's a language of carbon that we can all get around in the environmental space. There's a bit less of a comparable language in the social space. And in the same way as earlier on we discussed greenwashing, I think investors will remain cognizant of the risk of social washing. So I think developing that data will be very important to sort of ensure there's enough credibility when companies are communicating their strategies.
Yes, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of concept of social value and very large numbers being banded around sometimes about what has been created, which isn't necessarily actually being created by the business at hand, but being created by all sorts of other businesses that happen to be in their supply chain. So yeah, there's certainly a body of work to be done on getting to the bottom of some social value numbers and social impact numbers.
As we're coming to the end of our webinar, I'd like to turn to Martin for some questions. We've received a couple outside of the webinar tool, but feel free to submit any questions as participants. Martin?
Hi, lovely to be here. Quick introduction about myself. My name is Martin. I'm a postgraduate student at the LSE in the Regional Urban Planning Studies program. So just quick sort of question, firstly for Louise, and then for Robert, and then Arthur, if you want to chime in, feel free to do so as well. Towards the beginning of the talk, you briefly discussed how sort of the layout of cities is changing. Tangentially, you discussed sort of the impact of COVID on this. And I wanted to know if you could sort of A, speak a little bit more about how you see the layout of cities changing in itself, and B, what the impact of this might be on ESG. Louise, I think you're on mute.
Yep. How does layout of cities change in kind of, I think I've probably got 30 seconds, is that right? And the impact on the ESG. I think I mean, cities are very kind of long-term, in many ways, kind of sustainable urban forms, aren't they? So they evolve and they change, but fundamentally they've been resilient for kind of centuries in terms of the way in which we congregate. I don't see that suddenly we're not going to need city centres, or people aren't going to want to congregate in city centres. And I think Arthur kind of referred to, and Robert referred to, kind of what we saw in London over the weekend. People want to be together. I do think, however, that we may well use them slightly differently and at different times. I mean, there's a very interesting gendered piece around cities, and the way in which cities, be careful with that, the way in which cities are structured, which is set up around kind of masculine working patterns, if you like. Fundamentally, that's kind of where they come from. So I think quite a lot of that will change for a number of reasons. And as we get to be more thoughtful about the way in which we design new city centres and the way in which we redesign our existing city centres, I think there will be much more flexibility in that space, and there'll be much more variety in the types of space that you have within cities. I think a lot of the city centres and people who are already stakeholders and living in those cities are going to be much more vociferous and hold much more power around what we do in terms of green space and community space. So I think they will change. And I think that there's quite a lot of discussion at the moment about community land, community ownership of cities. All of those kinds of things, I think, will be part of a much wider debate about how you end up with cities which are ultimately, from our point of view, we want to have valuable city land. We want to increase land value in the city. So you need those areas to really work for their stakeholders, which means those local communities that want to be there, want to have some level of ownership, and can be productive there. They really need to be very productive. So they need to be healthy. I think, the way in which we've set them up around transport and around the car will change fundamentally. We will move much more to different types of delivery for transport as a service. All of those things will enable us to change the way we use car parks. There's a lot of land that's dedicated to parking cars, which I think will change. So there's lots and lots of different ways in which will change. And things like kind of just local power infrastructure, the access to local to electricity grids, all of those kinds of things, I think will change fundamentally the way we use our cities. So they've always been relatively sustainable. They've always flexed, and I think they'll continue to do so. So I think we may see some quite dramatic changes over the next 20, 30, 40 years in our city centres and how we work with them. And hopefully they'll be slightly less gendered. Somebody said to me the other day that the vast majority of trees in the city centre are male, even the trees.
But this is an interesting. I'm not an expert in this area, so it's a bit of a crystal ball of which way to go. But I think flexible working, and it includes not only working but schooling, how we work, how we operate, is going to change, because everything is geared towards 8 to 9 till 5, 9. Maybe that's how I work. Okay, but between 8 to 5. And that will change. That will have to change. You're not going to have, maybe we keep weekends, but overall the flexibility of whether we work mornings, afternoons, and therefore schooling, your social management of your time will again become, you can say maybe gender neutral, but it will sort of be, this is, and I agree with Louise here, these are old styles of working. It's from 9 to 5 because that's when the bloke went off to the dockworks or the mine, and they did the 8-hour shift. That's all changed, and as the shift basis has changed, I think we will go. But that's a separate debate and a separate issue, and I will raise my hand. I am not an expert in this area.
Oh, but it would be a fun one to have.
Arthur, do you have anything to add, or should we think we should move on?
No, I echo Robert's point that it is positive from a flexibility perspective that opens up a lot of opportunities for different people balancing their work and their other commitments. But equally, it also opens up lots of challenges in terms of the work life getting perhaps too mixed up with the personal life, and then so the hours potentially getting worse because you're changing your commute hours into work hours. So from a social point of view, we need to think very carefully about both those aspects.
Sure. Arthur, you were earlier talking about, and this is something that Robert touched on a lot, you were talking about how sort of young generations going into millennials, Generation Z, are more interested in ESG than sort of older generations. And I think that's a really good segue into Yoav Ginat's question. So I'll just read it out to you, and then, Robert and Louise, you guys feel free to, sort of opine as you see fit as well. So Yoav says, in terms of investors' approach, would you think that rather than the real estate investors refraining from investing in certain areas and sectors, they'll use their positions in their positions as shareholders to influence developments on the ground?
It's a great question, and I would, we're definitely seeing that trend. So if you think about ESG investing in sort of the 1970s and 80s, it was very much exclusion based. I'm not investing in apartheid South Africa assets. I'm not investing in oil. I'm not investing in coal, et cetera, which has sort of a place, but really there's limits to that. There's certain ESG investors, they say, well, we're not buying US treasuries because we don't agree with certain US government practices around defense and the death penalty. But once you start getting to that stage, there's very little you can have left in your asset. So just exclusion isn't the answer. It's a bit one-dimensional, a bit binary. So the trend we've seen in terms of new portfolios and new investment approaches in real assets and in the capital markets is one of management engagement. So using your influence as a debt investor or as a shareholder to try and encourage new practices and new behavior amongst management. So I think that this questioner, Yoav, is absolutely right that's the trend in this space. It's not just sort of not wanting to talk to people, but actually wanting to engage. And for me, a good anecdote was, we did a series of ESG speed dating sessions, quote unquote, one-on-one session between issuers and investors. And the companies, tobacco, defense, where you would think there'd be no appetite in speaking to them, they were highly oversubscribed. All the investors wanting to sort of understand their sustainability model and how they were trying to transition their business.
And I think maybe if I add here to ourselves as well, IFIs, we also do, it's not just debt, but we also do equity investments. We also do a lot of financial intermediaries and working with other financial institutions. And our modus operandi is quite often to actually get people to do more in terms of moving them along the trajectory of improving their EHS, the social environmental governance, and signing up to exclusion lists, signing up to certain practices, implementing best standards, or even, you could say, whether that's old hat, starting off with management systems and getting certified to certain management systems. And that, I think, is what Arthur was saying, is very much you trying to influence, and through being part of, you are putting in the right trajectory. And this is a key issue for us, particularly working in the Europe's near neighborhood countries, which we work, or further Central Asia, is to try to influence companies to go beyond compliance, beyond what their local stakeholders might even require, by influencing them to put best practices. They might not be there today yet, they might have not achieved everything, and as the saying goes, Rome was not built in a day, but you're getting them to sort of go on the right trajectory, to get the management to apply best practices, to ensure that they consider issues like human rights or social issues, or is a fundamental aspect that at least it resonates at the top. If it does, and people ask the questions, then hopefully they will develop the procedures and apply the best practices. And it's a journey. And I think this is a key issue. It is still a journey. We're still developing it. Wish it was faster, but it's still a journey.
Isn't that? And I think Robert's right. If you get down to kind of asset level, the shareholders are not really in a position to influence day to day on the design of a building. They're just not going to be able to sit in 3-hour design team meetings in order to see whether or not we really are doing the things that we say we are. But that's why it comes back to process and being able to demonstrate as a business that you really do have those robust processes in place. To some extent, I think, I mean, the shareholder community is very powerful, and for a business like us, if I can call on that community and my relationship to that community, and I have done this in the past, to actually influence some of the stakeholders who I'm struggling to work with, not internally, but some of our clients and things, and to actually say, well, actually, can you get this company to maybe have a conversation with me about what they're doing? That's very helpful. So I think the investor community sometimes doesn't realize quite how powerful it can be in moving the agenda forward if it kind of pokes in the right places. But it does come back to asking the occasional pertinent question. And you've only got to ask a CEO once or twice, or a CFO once or twice, actually what happened with this scheme, that they will make sure that they can always answer that question. And that's hugely powerful.
And I would agree here, is getting your CFO or the Chief Executive Officer being asked a question which they can't answer, or they're actually struggling with, or it is a reputationally embarrassing, means they'll ensure it doesn't happen again. So it is a very powerful tool. It doesn't happen again, but it's a question of, if it is something that is being asked, it is a topical issue, you will want to be among your peers. You will want to actually develop best practices. We're finding that some of the big companies we're working in emerging markets, in the markets we work, they want to be actually leaders in the region. They want to implement the best practices. They want to be able to raise financing in London or other markets. And that means they are more keen to implement certain best practices than in markets which are maybe a bit more saturated, or there is a local market that allows you to invest. So I think that's this peer pressure is very important in anything we do. In every day-to-day life is very important. It's same in business.
Thanks a lot. Conscious of time, we've already passed our time by 15 minutes. So we would like to close here. Sorry for the other questions, but I'm sure we'll have another session on these issues soon as LSE Greg. I would like to thank everyone, especially our speakers and all the participants who joined us today. And would you like to say anything, Martin and Adi, before we close?
Yeah, I'd just like to echo your comments. Thanks very much to the panelists. It was a fascinating discussion, and look forward to future LSE Greg events.
Yeah, just like Didem and Adi said, yeah, very interesting discussion. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you, Didem and Adi, for organizing this as well. And yeah, as a millennial / Gen Z person myself, I thought it was very interesting, your thoughts on sort of the future of ESG. So thank you for that.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a nice session.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Same. Thank you very much. And we're always available for, of course, questions and going forward. It's our profession is, you could say, our passion as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.